Alright, Bubbles, signed up. I'm here for my first therapy session. Lay it on me. You're the therapist, you're supposed to be asking me the questions. Bubbles, can you just play along for the intro? Ugh, I'm logging out of this session. What is up, everyone? Welcome to another video. Before we hit the computer and start coding, hit that subscribe button down below, leave a like if you're enjoying the content, and drop a comment down below. Let me know what you want to see coded up next. In this video, we are on episode 21 of our Hello World series. We're going to be implementing the logout functionality and a settings page where the user can update their information and change their password. We'll be using JavaScript to do the front-end validation, little HTML and CSS to style it up. Of course, we got to do the back-end validation. Never leave out the back-end validation, that's the most important part. If all validates and checks out, we are going to update the user's information in the database. If it does not check out, we are going to update our UI, the form elements, to let the user know exactly what went wrong and what they need to update in order to submit it again. As always, links will be in the description below to things like the GitHub repository, the live Hello World website, so you guys can see this code in action. And we got Bubbles merch on Printify. Check out the shop and support the channel there. Join the Discord server I got set up, join the community, and don't forget, Saturday mornings, live streaming on Twitch. I'll see you guys there. With that being said, let's hit the computer. What is up, everyone? Welcome to Hello World episode 21, user settings and logout. In this video, we're adding a logout functionality so the users can log out after they've logged in, and we're adding a user settings page so the user can go to that page and edit things like their first name, last name, email address, and they can change their password. The code for this is up on github.com/jstolpe/hello_world. Go check out the repository and clone it. You have the different branches here for all the different episodes we have done. So if you missed an episode, go check out the branch, and there's also a YouTube video in the Hello World playlist for that branch. I have the Hello World repository cloned into my www folder, and so here I am ready to go on my local host. I'm going to go ahead and create a branch for this episode, logout and settings. Make sure we're on our current branch, so we're good to go. Over in our browser, our local host, Hello World, we left off by logging the user in and updating this menu up here with a settings and a logout option instead of a sign in and a login option, because once they're logged in, we don't need to show them the login and sign in options. However, none of these options work now. I click on the settings and the settings doesn't work because there's no settings class set up yet. Same with the logout, no logout class. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with our logout functionality and create a class for logging the user out. Over in our Hello World app controllers, we're going to copy our login controller, call it logout. Then we'll open that in our editor and update it for logging the user out. Gotta update the class name, very important. And this is going to be a very short class because all we're going to do is log the user out with our index function here. So we're just going to hit this class, it'll go into the index function and log the user out. And we're going to handle the logout functionality over in our users model. So we're going to open up our users model in our models folder, and we're going to create a new function for logging the user out. Throw this down here at the bottom, copy our function name over. For our log user out functionality, we're going to be doing the opposite of what we did for the login user functionality. So here's our login model, login user, and to log user in, all we do is set the session user ID with the current user's ID that's logged in, and then we store all of their data, the user data, in the session, so we have access to it. So we're going to copy these two lines. First line, we're going to save the user ID for the session. Well, we're just going to set this to 0. That way, there's no user ID associated with the session anymore. And then we want to, instead of getting new user info and saving the session, we want to unset the user info that's associated with that session. Instead of calling set data, we're going to call unset data. And this will unset any data associated to the key that you specify. When we logged in, we stored the user info here into our user info key. Now we're going to unset that user info key so there is no user info in the session anymore. And last but not least, we're going to redirect the user to our home page. And now, when the user clicks log out, they're taken to our logout class controller, hits the index file, goes to our user model, does our log user out function, which sets the session user ID to 0, unsets the user info that was stored in the session, and then redirects the user to the login page. And we can test this out by going over to our browser. We're still logged in from the last video. If we click log out, we should be taken back to our home page, or sorry, the login page, because I did /login. So it worked. To double check if it worked, we can check if our menu up here has the sign in and the login options instead of the settings and the log out option. And it does. Because we're logged out, we can't go to our settings and we can't log out. Logging in again, our menu should have updated to our settings and our logout dropdown, and we have our logout working. Next, we're going to move on to our settings. Just like our logout, we need a new class. So we'll create a new class called settings. Class name of settings, and we're going to update our index function For starters, we're going to copy over everything from our home controller index function into our settings function and update accordingly, because we need a few different things in the settings versus the home. Leave the controller as it is. That's just getting the controller name. Then right after the controller is where we want to get our session data, so we have access to those variables like the first name, last name, email addresses. That's what we're going to want to display in the input fields when we display them to the user on the settings page. And we're going to store our session data in our session variable right here. And just to give you an even more clear picture of what this session variable will be, we'll dump out the session here in the browser. Refresh our class settings page. Now we have our session data pulled right from the session class. Our ID, timestamp, user ID, data, user info, which is all the info we grabbed out of the database from that user's row. Next, we're going to want to set the user's info variable. And we're going to call a users model get user with column value function. Column name we're going to be using is the ID. And the value we'll be using is from our session user info ID. That would be this ID right here. We're grabbing user info based off that ID. And the reason I'm grabbing the data again here right from the database on every page load instead of just using the session here is because just in case the user, has a couple tabs open, a different device or something, this will guarantee we're always displaying the most recent user's info from the database, not some outdated session user info data. Then we come to loading our view. So we have our HTML title here with a little title in the tab of the browser, HTML head, and the HTML body are the view files we have to create, and they're going to get loaded through our default template view. To create the view, we're going to go to our app views folder, copy over our home page, and rename this to settings. Inside of our settings is where we have our HTML body and HTML head, which get loaded here directly to these two data variables and then passed to the template. Now let's open up our HTML head and our HTML body. First thing here is our page-specific CSS file. So we're going to need to create a specific CSS file just for our settings page. Over in our app assets CSS, we're going to create a settings folder, and in that folder we're going to create a styles.css file. And then we also need to do the same for JavaScript because we want to have a JavaScript specific file for our settings page. So we're going to create a settings folder in our app assets.js folder, and then in our settings folder we're going to create a script.js file. This is where any JavaScript will go that is specific to the settings page. So we have our page specific CSS and our page specific JavaScript files created and loading only on the settings page. The last thing we need is our form helper. This is what we created to help us validate our sign-up form and our login form. Look at our sign-up HTML head. You'll see here is our form helper. So we're going to want to copy this over to our settings as well, so we can use our form helper with our settings body. Now we can move on to our HTML body for the settings page. Get rid of everything here because that was copied over from the home page. And we're going to kind of go off of our sign up HTML body because it's pretty much the same form with a few different tweaks. We'll begin with our section container. This is just going to wrap the whole form in a big div. Then comes our heading for the container. And we're on our settings page. Pause for a second, refresh our web page so we can see a little progress, and there we go. We got our section container with our heading settings. Now we have all of our inputs. We have our email, our username, our first name, last name, and I think we'll do those. We'll get those working first and then add our little checkbox toggle if they want to change their password or not. Copy everything here, these 4 inputs, into our settings. Under our heading, and we're going to update our inputs to have a class. Instead of sign up, we're going to call this our settings. And this is the prefix for our form helper, -fh. That's the form helper we wrote. If you guys missed that video, go check it out. It's going to be taking care of all of the validation for these different input fields. Now, since we're on the settings page and not the sign up page, we can actually populate these input fields with the user's info. To do that, we just have to add on our value, and we're going to do a PHP echo user info, and then this is the email. And we want to make sure we're escaping HTML everywhere that we're displaying it out to the user, especially since this is coming from the database. So we're going to do this escape HTML and add it on to each one of our inputs. Our next input is our user info username. Then we have our first name and last name. Refreshing our browser, and there we have our settings. Making some good progress. We have our email, username, first and last name all being pre-populated on our settings tab. Now we're going to add our update button. Come down here to form actions from our sign up. We'll copy over the sign up button. Update the text of the button to be update. Update the class here to be button-update, which is what we'll be targeting in our JavaScript for listening on for a click. With our form set up, we're going to head over to our JavaScript file. Just like our sign up form, we need a settings form, which is going to get passed into this function down here. And our form helper takes care of reading the HTML in. We just have to make sure that our prefix here, which was important, our settings-fh, this settings is the prefix. We have to tell our settings form here when we create a new form helper that we want to look at for anything with a settings prefix. So now this form helper is going to look and find each of these 4 input elements here based off of the settings-fh class. And then just like our sign-up form, we need to add an event listener for our button-update. So we're going to look for our class name button-update, which is the class that we put on our update button right here. Add event listener click, and instead of signing the user up, we're going to update the settings by calling this server update settings function right here and passing along our settings form. So now all of the HTML has been read into our form helper, the values for all the inputs, and it's going to be passed along into our update settings function. Back to our signup JavaScript, we want to make sure that we only send the data to the server if the form is valid. We'll copy our if statement here, but we have to make sure we're updating it with our settings form. So the settings form.validate is a function in our form helper. If we look at our form helper script.js, there's a validate function in here, and we pass in where we're coming from, in this case the front end, right from the HTML that the user has updated their inputs, and it's going to come in here and loop over all the form elements that it found, in our case the 4 inputs here, email, username, first name, last name, and then it's going to validate each one based on the data check that is placed inside of this input element here. So there's data check email, data check username, data check name, and name for the first and last name. In that for loop, each input is validated. You can see the form.check right here. We're checking for email, username. We'll do password and confirm password when we add on the password and confirm password input elements. If all those inputs validate, we can move on to passing our data to the server. Copy everything from our sign up over here. We're going to go ahead, we're going to show the loader because it's validated. We want to show the loader while the server is thinking and updating and wait for a response. Here's where the AJAX call happens. It's going to be a post request. URL is our base URL /settings controller. And we'll create an update function inside of our settings controller. Then in the data section, we have to make sure we pass along our settings form.getPostData over in our form helper. GetPostData just basically gets all the data from the HTML body here for each of the input elements, does a JSON stringify on it so it's ready to go to our server. Get rid of that. And then we have our success function, which just means we got a response back from the server. In this case, we want to double check that our data is valid, the data that came from the server this time. If it's valid, we're going to redirect the user. For whatever reason, the server comes back and the data is not valid from the server. We're going to hide the loader, and the form helper will take care of highlighting the error fields for the user and displaying those error messages, which we have set up right here in each of the input fields. So we have our data-message for the email would be email invalid or already registered. And we have a data message on each of these inputs that contains the error in case the value it's not valid. Back to our settings controller, we're going to create our update function here. First thing we're going to grab onto here is the form data. What this does here is creates a nice PHP array for our post form data, and that is coming straight from our post variable right here, form data, which is where we got the data with our form helper and did a JSON stringify on it. So now we're decoding that JSON that was stringified into a PHP array right here, form data. Then we're going to pass that form data into our settings model update function, where the model will take care of handling all the logic that needs to happen for updating the user. And like we've done for our sign up, we're going to echo out our form data right back to the AJAX call, which will come back right here in our response in the success function. And we're echoing this form data right back out because in this model function here, we're going to update this form data. So this isn't going to be the same as it was when it came in. If it came in good and we found errors in this update function, this form data will now contain errors, and then the front end will pick that up with our form helper script JavaScript, and it will update our HTML accordingly to show the error messages where it needs to show the error messages, or hide them where it needs to hide them. Now we don't have a settings model yet, so we're going to head over to our app models folder and create a settings model. And this model is going to take care of all the logic that we need for our settings page. All right, so we have our update function here that we're calling from our controller. Settings model update. Now we can go ahead and update the user's information. Before we can do that, we have to validate it server side as well. You always want to validate on the front end and on the back end, because you know people can fudge that JavaScript to make the data go through. So you always want to make sure you're validating on the back end as well. To do this, we're going to set up a validate settings form function. And right here, we're going to pass in our form data, and this function is taking this by reference. That's because we're going to be manipulating this form data. That way we don't need to return it. We can just update the form data in this function as needed, and it will get back to our update function up here. Form data right here will be updated according to our validate function, and then we can continue on here with our new validated form data. The first thing we want to do is grab onto our session data. Call this session variable. So now we have the data from the user session, and we're going to go ahead and do a get user info with that session, just like we did in the controller. Call this user info, get user info with the column ID and the session user info ID value. Now we're going to check for if the user is updating their email address. Our if statement looks like this. It says the user info email that we just got from the database, if that does not equal the form elements email value, which is the value from our HTML body right here that they entered in. The form elements is just simply the array keyed by the data column. We have a data column email, a data column username. Once we get into our PHP, it looks something like this. Form elements, we have email, value, username, value, first name, value, last name, value. And that's how you access that front end data here on the back end. Now, if they're trying to update their email, we have to validate that. And we'll create a new function for validating the email here on the settings form. Validate form user's email. We'll pass in the user's info we got from the session along with the form element for our email. And again, we're going to pass in the form element by reference this time, so when we do any updates to it in this validate function, it will be updated over here in our validate settings function form, which has also been passed in by reference. So by the time we get back to our actual update function and we start moving on from validating the settings form, those updates that we made all the way down to our form element email will be available to us, meaning this form data has been updated accordingly. For validating our email address, we have an if statement here. We're going to set our form element is valid equal to false. Otherwise, we'll set it to true. And this is valid comes in from the front end from our form helper JavaScript. And so we're just going to update it here. So when we send it back to the front end, it can update it accordingly. Now our if statement here, we have a couple things to check for validating the user's email. First thing is we want to do the same thing we did up here. Check the value. User's email does not equal the form element email value. It means they're trying to change the email. And this user's model, we do a get row with column value again here, just like we did up here. But this time we're going to get it based off of the email column, and we're going to pass in the form element email value that these are passed in. What we're saying here is if the user is trying to change their email, means the input field does not match their user info in the database, and we're also looking up that email that they're trying to change to. We're checking to see if another user has that email in the database. And if a row gets returned for that new email address that they're trying to update to, the form is valid is false because somebody already used that email address. We're going to put in an OR here because we also want to check for the email, the string being valid. Make sure it has an @ sign in it. Make sure that the string is in the valid format. And there's a function in the form helper that we can call form helper model is valid email, which just does the filter var to make sure that the email is in fact valid. And then we pass in the form element email value because that's the value that they entered into the input field. And we'll add on a little trim here to get rid of any trailing white space. Now we just have to update our form element here, and we're going to update the message. This would be the error message if there's an error, otherwise there is no message. If we're valid, we're going to just set the message to an empty string. Otherwise, we're going to set it to our form helper model, messages, and over in our form helper model, up at the top, we have our messages. So email invalid is the key, and it will display that message if we have an invalid email. Our form element email that we passed in has been validated with our isValid flag and message. Up here in our validate settings form, we passed in our email. We got to pass in just the email here, email array. Before we move on to the other inputs, let's echo out our form data. Back to our settings page. Let's open up the network tab here and click update. All right, there's our update function and our response here. Here's the form data that we passed to the server, and here's our form elements array that we've been looking at. So right now we've just validated our email array, and you see it is valid. Looking at our database quickly, phpMyAdmin database table users, our other user that is signed up here is world@hello. Now if we replace, let's say I'm logged in and I'm trying to update my email as hello@world, and I try to update it to world@hello. Go ahead and click the update function. Our response now, well, we got an error there. Right, next email, settings model 59. Got an email key issue here. Oh, and that's because we are passing in the email array to this form element, so the form element is the email.
array, so we don't need the array key there of email. Form element is the email array. Now let's try to update our email address here with email that already exists for another user. world@hello.com. Update. No errors. We're all good. Now our email should say invalid. Yep, false, and email invalid or already registered. Perfect. We know that our email validation is working. We can go ahead and move on to the next input, which is our username. We're going to do a similar check here, checking to see if the user updated the username. If the value does not match what's in the database for me, the current user that's logged in, updating the form, then we have to check to make sure the username is valid. And we only want to validate it if they're trying to change it. If they made no changes, there's no point in validating it. And so we'll set up another function here for validating the username. Pass along our user info and our username array, the actual value from the input form. And we'll have a very similar setup here to our email address. User info, form element passed in by reference so we can update it. Validate form username is the function name. And this is just like the email. We don't want anybody with the same username. So we're going to do the same checks here. We're going to say if user info username does not equal the form element value, username entered into the input field. We're going to look for any other user in the database by the username column. And we're going to look for the value of the new username that the user entered. Does that new username exist anywhere in the database? If it does, then we're going to set it to false. The form helper here also comes with a isValidUsername function to check username, pass in that value right here. Then all we have left to do is set our message, and instead of email invalid, we're going to use username invalid. Now our username has been validated. Then we have our first and our last name. No if statements here. We're just going to call this validate form name. All we're going to pass in here is our form data form elements first name. This function will be a lot simpler. Don't have to check the database for other users with the same first name or last name. And we'll also be using this same function for our last name. No user info, just pass in the form element by reference. And we can set our form is valid element right here directly to our validate name function from our form helper. And that function takes in the value for the form element that you're passing in. So our form element is valid flag has been set. We'll update our message accordingly, just like we've been doing. In this case, we're going to use our name invalid. It's not valid, name invalid. And that's all there is to updating the name. Copy that over. Next line will validate the last name. Form data, form elements, last name. The last thing we're going to do here is make sure we have a flag for the entire form. And the form helper helps us with this. Basically what it does is it looks through all the inputs that we have just validated, and if any of them are false, it will set the overall form valid flag to false. And we pass along the entire form data to this function. We have validated our settings form. And with that flag, we can check to see if we want to do anything further, like update the user's info in the database. If form helper form is valid, go ahead and update user info. No matter what happens, we're going to always return our form data. And this is a good place to pause and check out our browser again. Make sure everything's still working. If we go ahead and just click update, what should happen is everything should come back as true. Nothing will get updated on the server side, but the page should just send us back to the home page. We have our window location base URL, the validated response came back true. Now if we put in an invalid email address here and click update, it'll tell us email is invalid or already registered. Well, we know that the front end is taking care of this, so no response even went to the server. As you see in the network tab, update, nothing's going to the server because the front end validation already failed. But the front end does not know that this user already exists in the database. Let's refresh the page here just to get a clear slate. Now, if we do world@hello.com, the front end validates this email address because the front end does not know that the user exists in the database. We have to go to the server to figure that out. For testing purposes, I'm going to comment these things out here, the loader and the redirect, so we can stay on the same page. We don't have to keep refreshing the page every time because the loader pops up. So now the loader won't pop up, so we can just keep clicking update. Clicking update here, we passed the front end checks, so we got the request to the server. The request came back, and as you can see here, our form is valid, came back to be true. That means all of our form elements inside here as well validated to true. If I pass in a world@hello.com and I click update, our email should be false, but it's true somehow. How did we miss that? World@hello.com. Back in our settings model, form data, we're turning form data here to update. But we're not storing it in anything. We need to make sure that we're updating our form data to what is happening in our update function. So now when we hit the update function here, get our form data back, it's working as expected. Is valid false, and the form is valid as false. For some reason, we're not getting the highlighted field here for being invalid. And that is because this is commented out right here. Our settings validate response data is what takes care of updating the UI. It's commented out, so it wasn't working. Go ahead and see if we can get this to work now. So now when we come back from the server, world at hello.com, click update. There we go. We did go to the server, came back, marked the email as false, and so it displayed that error. If I go hello2, it's going to be valid email on the front end. It's still going to go to the server with our request, but that error should go away. Right? But if we add a world at hello2, it should be good to go. And yes, it's valid, true, but we're not hiding our error message. The red border went away, so we just have a little UI bug there in our form helper. Looks like our UI bug here is not falling into displaying our message, setting it to display none, and that's because we should only be checking for a message. If there's a message, we want to show it. If there's not a message, we don't need to show it. We don't care about the is valid because the message is the error. If there's a message, display it. If there's not, don't display it. This one last try over here. Hopefully we're up and running now. World at hello, get our error. There we go. But if we try to do a new email, it doesn't exist in the database. The red border goes away and the error message is gone. Uncomment everything here. We got our loader showing. Our validation is working. Last thing we have to do is actually update the user's info. Now that all the validations are working, back to our if statement right here. If the form data is valid. We're going to create an update data array. And we're just going to update everything in the database that was validated. First thing is the email. The value is validated. Then we have our username, form elements username value. And then our first and our last name. First name, last name. That's the data that's going to be updated in the database. We're going to do a session user info here. After our update data, we're going to get the user info from our session. Then we're going to update our user in the user's model. Update user. Call this session user info. We're going to pass in our session user info ID and our update data. Down here below our log user out function, we're also going to have an update data array in our users model function. Make it a little bit reusable that way in case we have other places on the site in the future we want to call. Pass in the user ID and the info we want updated. Our update data here looks something like this. Info, email. And we're going to want to trim this to make sure that we don't get any trailing spaces. And we're going to do the same for the other four. Then we just have to call our database helper table, set the table name, where ID in the database equals the user ID that was passed in. And then we're going to call a run update query. And all we do is pass in our update data. Back to our settings model, we have updated our user. So what we want to do is get that user from the database. So after we've updated our user, the user ID from the session, we're going to use that to grab onto the user's row again from the database, which now should have the updated values that they updated from the form. All that's left to do then is store the data in the session. Set data for our user info key to our new updated user. Let's try to update our first and last name. Hello first, hello last. Go ahead and click update. We've been redirected to our home page, which is a good sign, meaning validations passed. We went to the server and updated our first and last name. No errors there, and we got redirected. So if we go back to our settings page here, we see that our hello first name has been updated here, but for some reason our email is here as our last name, which doesn't make much sense. I'm guessing we have a key issue here in our code somewhere. So if I go back to the users table here, yeah, look at the last name got saved as hello world, which means that over in our update function, there it is. We have our last name set to our info email, which is bad. Update last name equals last name. Good thing is we know our settings is working now. So if I just update this to hello last, now we got the keys correct on the back end. Click update, back to our settings page. We have updated our first and our last name. Our settings is working. Now we're going to add on the change password functionality. So we're going to begin with the front end here and just add on a checkbox. And if you toggle it, it'll show the password and confirm password. If you uncheck it, it'll hide them. Back to our sign up HTML body, we have two rows here for password and confirm password. We're going to copy those over to our settings form right under our last name. We want to make sure we update the inputs with our prefix of settings instead of sign up so that they get pulled in along with all the other inputs. Everything else can stay the same. We're not going to pre-populate password or confirm password with any values ever. Now our settings looks like this, password and confirm password. Above the confirm password, we're going to create a row with an input, but this is going to be a checkbox. We're going to type of checkbox. There is no placeholder for the checkbox. We'll get an ID of change password. Pass on here, we're going to give it a change password class. Data column here will be change password. We don't need a data check or a message on this checkbox. Also don't need an error message, but we do need a label. Change password. It's going to be for our change password ID. Class equals default label. We're going to add a few styles for those classes there over in our styles.css for the settings. Change password, we want it to always be a cursor pointer. And then our change password container is going to be a display none. So when the page loads, it's always going to be displayed none. This password container is what we're going to wrap our two input fields in. Over in our body here, our password and confirm password. By default, this is set to display none until you click on the change password checkbox. For the onClick event, we're going to copy over this button update event here. Update our click event to listen for the change password class. First thing inside of here is changing the container that we just set up. We'll do a get by class name right here on our container. Change password container, and we're going to do a .style.display, and this is going to be set to if this .checked, meaning the checkbox is checked, we're going to set it to display block. Otherwise, we'll set it to display none. Over on our settings page, if we check the box, it expands and shows us our two new inputs. If we uncheck it, it goes away. Next up, we want to do a few things for each of our inputs based on if it's checked or not. So if it's checked, we want to make sure that the form helper on the front end is checking to see if those values are correct, if they meet the password length, and if the password matches the confirmed password. If the checkbox is not checked, we want to make sure we are removing those elements from the form helper so it doesn't check the password and confirm password because the user is not trying to update their password. Basically, if it's not checked, we're not going to do any checks on passwords at all because we're not updating it. And to do this, we simply update our form elements in our settings form with the form helper. Set form element check. We're going to make sure that our password is using the password check with the form helper, and our confirm password is using our confirm password check with the form helper. If the checkbox is not checked, we don't want to do any checks. So we just remove the check that we're specifying here, which is the second parameter from each of these calls. Now the front end is not going to check the password, it's not going to check the confirm password. And we can hit our settings page, we can check the box, and if we click update right now, it's going to tell us the passwords don't match. If we enter a password here, and we click update, passwords matched, it went to the server. The server's not doing anything with passwords right now because we have to add that functionality, but the front end checks passed, and so it sent the data to the server. Now we can move on to the back end. To our back end settings model update function is where we're going to start for updating our password. Like all the other inputs, we're going to go ahead and validate it. So heading to our validate settings form function, right after our last name validation is where we're going to validate our passwords. We're going to validate the password, and then we're going to validate the confirm password. We're going to create a function called validate form password. Pass along the password that was entered in the form data password. Creating a new function here for validate form password. Takes in our form element. We can directly set the is valid right here because it's a simple check for the length of the password. So form element, is it valid or not? We'll use our form helper model to determine this. Is valid password. Form element value. Then, like all of our other validation functions, we're going to set our message based on if it's valid or not. Form element valid. And we just have to update our message here with our password invalid. Password invalid. We copy this one too many times. Validate form password. Now we just have to validate the confirm password. Create another function for validating the confirm password. Pass in our confirm password. And we're also going to pass in the password because we're going to want to compare these two things. Copy over our password function, validate form, confirm password. So we have our form element for confirm password, and then we have our form element password. Again, we're just going to set our is valid right here. We still want to make sure that that's a valid password, and we want to make sure that our confirm password value equals our password. And our message can stay the same, password invalid if it's invalid. We've added on our password and confirm password to our validate settings form function. Both those things check out. Now we're going to fall into our form is valid and we're going to have to update the user's info, but we need to make sure we're adding on the password so the password gets updated when the user clicks update. To do that, we're going to modify this update array only if the change password checkbox is checked. We'll have a 1 if it's checked and it won't have any value if it's not checked. Going to add on to our update data array a password. Password will be our form elements password value. Moving it down a few more lines to where we pass along that update data to our update user function in the users model, we also have to accommodate for that password coming through in this update user function. Now, this info array right here could possibly have a password coming along. Is set info password. If this update data contains a password, we know that we're trying to update the password. If that checkbox is not checked, then we don't append on the password to the update data. So we don't add it on here when we do the update. The update data password equals here we're obviously not storing plain text passwords in the database, so we're gonna do a password hash on this. We're taking our info password and hash it with our password default. Now the password will be hashed before it gets stored in our database. Now we're gonna go ahead and test this out. Change password 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. Very secure password. Let's update it. Looks like the update went through. The only way to test this out is to go ahead and log out and try to log in with our old password and see if we can't log in. If I try to log in with my old password, look at that. It's highlighting these fields saying there's some sort of error. If I try to log in with 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8, log in. My password was successfully updated on our settings page. So we have our settings page set up where we can update our user info, we can change our password, and we have our logout functionality working as well. Logout, log in, sign up, and that's where we're going to wrap up Hello World episode 21, users, settings, and logout functionality. We did go over a lot in this video, from the front end to the back end for setting up the user's settings page, and then finally logging the user out. I hope this video was helpful, and I hope you guys learned something from this video. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, drop a comment down below, let me know what you want to see coded up next. I'll catch you later.